everybody, welcome to my channel. How's everybody doing today? Today I want you to sit back and relax as I read to you Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. If you hear a little bit of snoring, Nikki is already asleep before I have started the book. You have the rabbit, Alice, and the cat. Such a nice book. Here is the side of the book. So nice. Here's the back of the book with the Mad Hatter. Such a nice book. And it is loaded with lots of pop-ups in it, as you see. Which we will be going over together. So sit back and relax as I read to you Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Look how beautiful this is. So pretty. It says, there's Alice, the rabbit, a little girl, and a lot of trees. It says, Alice was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank and of having nothing to do. Once or twice she had peeped into the book her sister was reading, but it had no pictures or conversations in it. And what is the use of this book, thought Alice, without pictures or conversations? That must be her sister then. Suddenly, a white rabbit ran close by her. There was nothing so very remarkable in that, nor did Alice think it was very much out of the way to hear the rabbit say to itself, oh dear, I shall be too late." But when the rabbit actually took a watch out of its waistcoat pocket, Alice started to her feet. She ran across the field after it, and just in time to see it pop down a large rabbit hole under the hedge. In another moment, Alice went after it. The rabbit hole went straight on like a tunnel for some way, and then dipped suddenly down, so suddenly that Alice found herself falling down, it seemed, to a very deep well. Either the well was very deep or she fell very slowly, for she had plenty of time to look about. She looked at the sides of the well and noticed that they were filled with cupboards and bookshelves. There and here and there saw maps and pictures hung upon pegs. Down, down, down. Would the fall never come to an end? She felt like she was dozing off and had just begun to dream when suddenly, thump, thump, down she came upon a heap of sticks and dry leaves. Before her was another long passage, and the white rabbit was still in sight, hurrying down it. She was close behind it, and she turned the corner, but the rabbit was no longer to be seen. She found herself in a long, low hall. Suddenly she came upon a little three-legged table. She found a little bottle on it, and the words "Drink me" printed on it. Alice ventured to taste it, finding it very nice, and she soon finished it off. "What a curious feeling," Alice said. "I must be sitting up like a telescope." And so it was indeed. She was now only 10 inches high. Soon her eyes fell upon a little glass box that was laying under the table. She opened it and found a very small cake, and the words "Eat me" were marked in currants. So she set to work and very soon finished off the cake. "Curiouser and curiouser," cried Alice. "Now I am opening out like the largest telescope ever." Just in that moment, her head struck against the roof. In fact, she was now more than 9 feet high. Poor Alice! She sat down and began to cry. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," said Alice. "A great girl like you to go on crying like this." But she went on all the same, shedding gallons of tears until there was a large pool around her. After a time, she heard a little pattering of feet in the distance. That's Nicky in the background there. It was the white rabbit with a pair of white kid gloves in one hand and a large fan in the other. Alice felt so desperate that she was ready to ask for help of anyone. So she went to the rabbit. So when the rabbit came near her, she began in a low, timid voice, "If you please, sir." The rabbit dropped the white gloves and the fan and scurried away into the darkness. Alice took up the fan and gloves, and as the hallway was very hot, she kept fanning herself all of the time. She went on talking, "Dear, dear, how queer everything is today." So she looked down at her hands and was surprised to see that she had put on one of the rabbit's little white gloves while she was talking. "How could I have done this?" she thought. "I must have been growing small." She got up and found that she was now about 2 feet high. The cause of this was a fan she was holding, and she dropped it hastily. "That was a narrow escape," said Alice. As she said these words, her foot slipped. In another moment, she was up to her chin in salt water, the pool of tears that she had wept when she was 9 feet high. "I wish I hadn't cried so much," said Alice, as she swam about. "I shall be punished for it now, I suppose, by being drowned in my own tears." Alice went on and swam to shore. Poor Alice felt very lonely and low-spirited. In a little while, however, she heard a little pattering of footsteps in the distance. It was the white rabbit, trotting slowly back again and looking anxiously about as if he had lost something. She heard it muttering to itself, the Duchess, she will get me executed as sure as ferrets are ferrets. Where can I have dropped them?" Alice guessed in a moment it was looking for the fan and a pair of white gloves. They were nowhere to be seen. Soon the rabbit noticed Alice and called out to her, "Run home this moment and fetch me a pair of gloves and a fan." Alice was so frightened that she ran off at once in the direction it pointed to. "Open me." "Pull me up and look inside." she came upon a neat little house on which was a brass plate with the name W. Rabbit. She went in and found her way to a tidy little room with a table and a window, and on it a fan and a tiny white kid gloves. She took up the fan and the gloves and was just going to leave the room when her eyes fell upon a little bottle. There was no label on it this time, but nevertheless she uncorked it and put it to her lips. I do hope this makes me grow large again, for I am quite tired of being such a little thing. It did indeed. Before she drank half the bottle, she found her head pressing against the ceiling. She hastily put down the bottle, saying, "It's quite enough. I hope I shan't grow any more." Alas, it was too late to wish that. She went on growing and very soon had to kneel down on the floor. She still went on growing and, as a last resource, put one of her arms out the window and the other foot up the chimney. After a few moments, she heard a voice outside, "Fetch me my gloves this moment." Presently the rabbit came up to the door and tried to open it, but the door opened inward, and Alice's elbow pressed against it hard. That attempt proved a failure. Alice heard the rabbit say to itself, "Then I'll go around and get in the window." "That you won't," thought Alice, and after she heard the rabbit under the window, she suddenly spread out her hand and made a snatch in the air. She didn't get a hold of anything, but she heard a little shriek and a fall and a crash of broken glass. After a moment or two, Alice heard the rabbit say, "A burrowing will do." "A burrowing of what?" thought Alice. The next moment, a shower of little pebbles came rubbling up at the window. Alice noticed with some surprise that the pebbles were all turning into little cakes, and a bright idea came into her head. She swallowed one of the cakes and was delighted to find that she began shrinking. As soon as she was small enough to get out the door, she ran off as hard as she could to find another safe place in the thick woods. Alice looked around her and at the flowers and the blades of grass. There was a large mushroom growing near her, about the same height as hers. She stretched herself on a tiptoe and peeped over the edge of the mushroom, and her eyes immediately met one of those large blue caterpillars quietly smoking a long hookah. The caterpillar addressed her in a languid, squeaky voice. "Who are you?" Alice replied rather shyly. I hardly know, sir. I can't remember things as I used to. I don't keep the same size for 10 minutes. "What size do you want to be?" he asked. Well, I should like to be a little larger, sir," said Alice. 3 inches is such a record height to be." "It's a very good height indeed," said the caterpillar, rearing itself up as it spoke. It was exactly 3 inches high. The caterpillar got down off the mushroom and crawled away, remarking as it went, "One side will make you grow taller, the other side will make you grow smaller." Alice remained looking thoughtfully at the mushroom, trying to make out which were the 2 sides of it. As it was perfectly round, she found this very difficult question. She stretched out her arms around it and broke off a bit of the edge with each hand. "And now, which is which?" she said. and nibbled a little bit of the right hand bit. The next moment she felt a blow underneath her chin. It had struck her foot. Her chin pressed so closely against her foot there was hardly any room to open her mouth. She said at the last moment and managed to swallow a morsel of the left hand bit. "My head's free at last," said Alice, in a tone of delight which changed into alarm. All she could see when she looked down was the immense length of her neck that seemed to rise like a stalk out of the sea of the green leaves that lay far below. As there seemed to be no chance of getting her hands up to her head, she tried to get her head down to them. It was delighted to find that her neck would bend about easily in any direction. A large hiss made her draw back into a hurry. A large pigeon has flown into her face. "Serpent!" screamed the pigeon. "I am not a serpent," said Alice indignantly. "Let me alone." "We'll be off then," said the pigeon in a sulky tone as it settled down into the nest. Alice crouched down among the trees as well as she could. She remembered that she still held a piece of the mushroom and set to carefully nibble first at one and then the other until she succeeded in bringing herself down to her usual height. It was so long since she had been anything near her right size, and it felt quite strange at first, but she got used to it in a few minutes. She came upon an open place with a little house in it about 4 feet high. "Whoever lives there," thought Alice, it'll never do to come upon this size. Why should I frighten them out of their wits?" She began nibbling on the right hand bit again, and she brought herself down to about 9 inches. Suddenly a footman came running out of the wood. Judging by his face, only she would have called him a fish, and rapped loudly on the door. It was opened by another footman with a round face, large eyes like a frog. The fish footman began producing a letter, saying in a solemn tone, "For the Duchess, an invitation from the Queen to play croquet." Then they both bowed low, and their curls got tangled together. When the fishman was gone, Alice went timidly up to the door and knocked. In that moment the door opened, and a large plate came skimming out and broke into pieces. The door led right into a large kitchen, which was full of smoke. The Duchess was sitting on the stool, nursing a baby. The cook was leaning over the fire, stirring a large cauldron, which steamed full of soup. "There's certainly too much pepper in that soup," said Alice. There was certainly too much of it in the air. Even the Duchess sneezed occasionally, and as for the baby, it was sneezing and howling alternately, without even a moment's pause. The only 2 creatures in the kitchen that did not sneeze were the cook and a large cat sitting on the hearth and grinning from ear to ear. "Please, would you tell me," said Alice, a little timidly, "why your cat grins like that?" "It's a Cheshire Cat," said the Duchess pig. She said the last words with such a sudden violence that Alice jumped, but she saw that it was addressed to the baby. The cook took the cauldron of soup off the fire at once, set it to work, throwing everything within reach at the Duchess and the baby. "Oh, please," Mind what you are doing, cried Alice. Here, you may nurse it a bit if you like, the Duchess said to Alice, flinging the baby at her as she spoke. I must go and get ready to play croquet with the Queen. And she hurried out of the room. The cook threw a frying pan after her as she went, but it missed. Alice caught the baby with some difficulty, as it was a queer-shaped little creature. The poor little thing was snorting like a little steam engine and kept doubling itself up and straightening itself out again, so she carried it out into the open air. The little thing grunted, and Alice looked anxiously into the face. It had a very turned-up nose, much more like a snout than a real nose. Also, its eyes were getting extremely small for a baby. The thing sobbed again or grunted. It was like impossible to say which. This time there could be no mistake about it. It was a pig. She set the little creature down and felt quite relieved when she saw it trot about quietly into the woods. It would make a dreadfully ugly child, she thought, saying to herself, when she was a little startled by seeing the Cheshire Cat sitting on a bough of a tree. The cat only grinned when it saw Alice. Cheshire Puss, she began rather timidly, would you tell me, please, which way I have to go from here? That depends a good idea on where you want to go, said the cat. In that direction lives the Hatter. In that direction lives a March Hare. Do you play croquet with the Queen today? I should like to very much, said Alice, but I haven't been invited. You'll see me there, said the cat, and it vanished quite slowly, beginning with a tail and ending with a grin, which remained some time after the rest had gone. Well, I've often seen a cat without a grin, thought Alice, but a grin without a cat? She had gone not much further before she came in sight of a house of the March Hare. There was a table set under a tree in front of the house, and the March Hare and the Hatter were having tea at it. The Dormouse was sitting between them, fast asleep. No room, no room, they cried when they saw Alice coming. There's plenty of room, said Alice indignantly, and she sat down on a large armchair at one end of the table. The Hatter was the first to break the silence. What day of the month is it? He said, turning to Alice. He had taken his watch out of his pocket and was looking at it uneasily and holding it to his ear. Alice considered a little and said, the 4th. 2 days wrong, sighed the Hatter. Alice had been looking over her shoulder with some curiosity at what a funny watch it was. She remarked, it tells the day of the month and doesn't tell what o'clock it is, said the Hatter. It's 1:30. Time for dinner. I only wish it was, the March Hare said to itself in a whisper. We quarreled last March, replied the Hatter, pointing with his teaspoon down at the March Hare. It was a great concert given by the Queen of Hearts, and I had to sing, Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder where you're at. Up upon the world I fly, like a tea tray in the sky. Well, I finally finished the first verse, said the Hatter, and the Queen bawled out, he's murdering the time, off with his head. How dreadfully savage, exclaimed Alice. Suppose we change the subject, the March Hare interrupted. Really, now you ask me, said Alice, I don't know. Then you shouldn't talk, said the Hatter. This point of rudeness was more than Alice could bear. She got up with disgust and walked up. Neither of the others took the last notice of her going. The last time she saw them, they were trying to put the dormouse into the teapot. "I will never go there again," said Alice as she picked her way through the wood. "It is the stupidest tea party I've ever been at all my life." Just as she said, she noticed that one of the trees had a door leading right into it. "That's very curious," she thought, "but everything is curious today." And in she went. She found herself inside a beautiful garden among the bright flowers and beds and cool fountains. A large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing in it were white, but there were 3 gardeners at it, busily painting them red. Alice thought this was a very curious thing, and just as she came upon, she heard one of them say, "Look out now, 5. Don't splash paint all over me like that." "Would you please tell me," said Alice, "why are you painting the roses red?" The 2 began in a low voice, "Why, you see, miss, this here ought to have been a red rose tree, but we put a white one in by mistake, and a queen was to find out, we should have our heads cut off." At that moment, 5 called out, "The queen, the queen," and the 3 gardeners threw themselves flat upon their faces. First came 10 soldiers, all shaped like the 3 gardeners, then 10 courtiers. After these came the royal children, the little deers jumping merrily around, hand in hand. Next came the guests, and among them Alice recognized the white rabbit. Then followed the knave of hearts, and last of all came the king and queen of hearts. The procession came opposite Alice, and the queen said severely, "Who is this? What is your name, child?" "My name is Alice." "So pleased to meet your majesty," said Alice very politely. But she added to herself, "Why, they're only a pack of cards. I need not be afraid of them." "And who are those?" said the queen, pointing at the 3 gardeners who were laying on top of the rose tree. "How should I know?" said Alice, surprised with her own courage. The queen turned crimson with fury and began screaming, "Off with her head! Off!" "Nonsense," said Alice, and the queen was silent. The king laid his hand upon her arm and timidly said, "Consider, my dear, she's only a child." "I see," said the queen. "Can you play croquet?" "Yes," shouted Alice. "Come on, then. Get in your places," shouted the queen. The people began running around in all directions, tumbling up against each other. However, they got settled down in a minute and began to play. Alice thought she had never seen such a curious croquet ground in her life. The croquet balls were live hedgehogs, and the matters were live flamingos. The soldiers had to double themselves up and stand on their hands and their feet like arches. Alice began and wondering whether she could get away without being seen. Then she noticed a curious appearance in the air. She made it out to be a grin. "It's the Cheshire Cat, and now I should have somebody to talk to." "How are you going on?" said the cat as soon as there was a mouth enough for it to speak with. In another moment the whole head appeared, and Alice began in an account of the game, feeling very glad she had someone to listen to her. "I don't think they play at all fairly," Alice began, "and they all quarreled so dreadfully. One can't hear oneself speak." The cat's head began fading and disappeared entirely. "Let's go on with the game," said the queen, and Alice slowly followed her back to the croquet ground. All the time they were playing, the queen never left off quarreling with the other players and shouting, "Off with his head," or "Off with her head." Those whom were sentenced were taken into custody by the soldiers. By the end of half an hour, all the players except the king, queen, and Alice were under sentence of execution. The queen, quite out of breath, said to Alice, "Have you seen the mock turtle yet?" "No," said Alice. "I haven't seen I don't even know what a mock turtle is." "It's a thing mock turtle soup is made from," said the queen, "and we shall tell you his history." As they walked off together, Alice heard the king say in a low voice to the company generally, "You are all pardoned." "Come, that's a good thing," she said to herself. They were very soon upon the griffin, laying fast asleep in the sun. "Up, lazy thing," said the queen. "You shall take this young lady to see the mock turtle. I must go back to see after the executions I ordered." The griffin sat up and rubbed his eyes. "It's all her fancy, that. They never execute nobody, you know. Come on." They had not gone far before they saw the mock turtle sitting sad and lonely on the ledge of a rock. Alice pitied him deeply. "This young lady," said the griffin, "wants to know your history." I'll tell it," said the mock turtle in a deep, hollow tone. "Once I was a real turtle when I were little and went to school in the sea." "I've been to day school too," Alice said. "We learned French and music." "How many hours a day do you lesson?" 10 hours the first day," said the mock turtles, 9 hours, and then so on. "And that's the reason they're called lessons," the griffin remarked, "because they lesson from day to day." The mock turtle sighed deeply. He looked at Alice and tried to speak, but for a moment sobs choked his voice. "You may not live much under the sea." "I haven't," said Alice. "So you have no idea what a lobster quadrille is?" "No, indeed," said Alice. "What sort of dance is that?" "Would you like to see a little of it?" said the mock turtle. "Very much indeed," said Alice. They became solemnly dancing round and round Alice, every now and then treading on their toes when they passed too close, waving their forepaws. The little mock turtle sighed so deeply and began to sing in a voice sometimes choked with sobs, when a cry of "The trial's beginning" was heard in the distance. "Come on," cried the griffin, and taking Alice's hand and hurry off. "What is a trial?" Alice panted as she ran, but the griffin ran faster. The king and the queen of hearts were seated on their throne, with a great crowd assembled around them. The knave was standing before them in chains, and near the king was the white rabbit with the trumpet in the hand and a scroll in the other. In the middle of the court was a table with a large dish of tarts upon it. It made Alice quite hungry to look at them. "I wish they'd get the trial done," she thought, and hand round the refreshments. "Herald, read the accusation," said the king. The white rabbit blew the trumpet and rolled the scroll and read as follows. "The queen of hearts, she made some tarts, all on a summer's day. The knave of hearts, he stole the tarts and took them quite away. Consider your verdict." The king said to the jury. Not yet," the rabbit said hastily, interrupting. "There's a good deal more to come before that." "Call the first witness," said the king. The first witness was the Hatter. "Take off your hat," said the king. "It isn't mine," said the Hatter. "Stolen," the king exclaimed. "Give your evidence and don't be nervous, or I'll have to execute on the spot." Just at this moment, Alice felt a very curious sensation. She began to grow larger again. The miserable Hatter went down on one knee. "I am a poor man, your majesty," he began. You're a very poor speaker," said the king. "If that's all you know, about it, you may go. And take his head off outside, the queen added to one of the officers, but the Hatter was out of sight before the officer could get to the door. Call your next witness, said the king. Alice watched as the White Rabbit, feeling very curious to see what the next witness would be like. Imagine her surprise when the White Rabbit read out at the top of his squirrel little voice the name Alice. Here, cried Alice, forgetting how large she had grown as she had grown in the last few minutes. She jumped up in a hurry that she tipped over the jury box, upsetting all the jurymen. Oh, I beg your pardon, she exclaimed as she began picking them up quietly as she could. The king shouted out, Silence, and read out from the book. Rule 42, all persons more than a mile high leave the courtroom. Everybody looked at Alice. I'm not a mile high, said Alice. You are, said the king. Nearly 2 miles high, added the queen. Why, there they are, said the king, trumpetly pointing at the tarts on the table. Nothing can be more clearer than that. Let the jury consider their verdict. No, no, said the queen. Sentence first, verdict afterward. Nonsense, nonsense, Alice said loudly. Hold your tongue, said the queen, turning purple. I won't, said Alice. Off with her head, and the queen shouted. Nobody moved. Who cares for you, said Alice. She had grown to her full size by this time. You're nothing but a pack of cards. At this point, the whole pack rose up into the air and came falling down upon her. She gave a little scream and tried to beat them off, and found herself laying with her head in the lap of her sister, who gently was brushing away some leaves that had fallen down on her face. Wake up, Alice, dear, said the sister. Why, what a long sleep you've had. Oh, I have had a curious dream, said Alice, and she told her sister all the strange adventures. When she had finished, her sister kissed her and said, It was a curious dream, Alice, but now it's getting late. So Alice got up and ran off, thinking, while she ran, what a wonderful dream it had been.